I often get asked when we do work with schools or different places or colleges, what one piece of advice would you give to somebody who wants to come into the environmental sector?
That's a good one. For me, if I went back to when I was looking, it'd be just being willing to engage and talk to people, but also willing to learn. It's like flood modelling as a skill as itself. It's not something you get taught at school or university. It's very much something you kind of learn on the job or learn through training courses. So having some interest in maths, maybe even a bit of English, just to kind of understand how some of these numbers come around, but also it's, that willingness to just be like, oh yeah, I understand this process. How does it get from these numbers here to this map you see in front of you? It's just having that enthusiasm to learn, basically.
And what about you, Dan? Because you're an associate director now, so your career path's been quite different with a few of the companies. What sort of tips would you give to people?
Well, when I went straight through. I did my undergraduate and then I had to do a master's to be able to even get an interview in the industry. These days it's a little bit easier potentially, but I would, where possible, either do a summer placement or, if you can, a sandwich degree with a year in industry.
And I think something that I'd say as an employer is that what we have seen is many of the best staff that we've brought through have come through either sandwich years or have been placement students and come forward. And I can obviously say that for you, Helena. Okay, so just moving back to the flood risk side. Dan, what would you say your top tips are for a successful flood risk assessment?
Understanding your site first, so definitely getting the baseline conditions and going through the process of doing a walkover, seeing the site for yourself, looking for those constraints and opportunities, undertaking consultation with the regulators early doors to get a response back in time that you can integrate that into your report.
And yourself, Helena?
It's a good one, because Dan's taken most of my words. For me, number one is consultation with the regulators, because you need agreement straight away. This is what we're working with, and as soon as you've got agreement on this is the flood risk, and then you can start influencing other sectors such as landscape design, and then you can start developing your layout and ecology. So it all links together. It's just getting agreement on certain aspects.
And that makes total sense, that once you've got agreement on a baseline for something, then that baseline's agreed, and then you can start to map out and deliver. Whereas if it's not agreed, you're always back to the baseline at each point of the argument and the constraints. So just my final question before we come to a close. How much does all this cost, Dan? If we talk about the flood risk assessment and drainage from your side, and then the modelling from your side, Helena. So Dan, how much does all this cost in broad numbers?
A lot has changed in policy and guidance over the last particularly five years, which has put more emphasis on more detail in our reporting. So we need to put more information in for SUDS design, water quality, flood mapping. So that is reflected in the cost of these reports. So a typical flood risk assessment, somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000, depending on the level of complexity.
And what about for the more complex sites, so sort of large strategic land developments? They'd be much more expensive, wouldn't they?
It would be scaled up. So you would put more detail in, particularly for the drainage aspects, are getting more expensive for the level of detail. So you're typically needing to have, even at outline stage, to have manhole cover levels, inlet levels, pipe sizes, and a basic network model. Yeah,
and that obviously comes with more time and cost. And what about modelling, Helena? Because it obviously depends on how much of a river or how much of an area you're modelling.
Yeah, and it also kind of depends on if we're just rerunning a model or new build. So kind of if we're rerunning an existing Environment Agency model, depending on what needs to be done, say if you might need to update the hydrology, but for a simple just rerun, you're probably starting about 3,500, anywhere up from there, depending on what the requirements of the Environment Agency are themselves, because it just keeps changing so often of what kind of needs to be done. Whereas a new model build, we're probably starting about 7.5, because you've got to kind of remember we've got the model build, but you've also, and then there's the additional survey cost, because you need to have whatever data you put in builds a better model. And then remember you've got to do the hydrology. So there's all these different aspects of, it may look like at the end of the day you're just getting a pretty drawing with some colours on that show you where areas flood, but in reality there's hundreds of hours of work that have gone into doing this map. So yeah, you're probably starting around the £7,500 for a new model build, anyway upwards, depending on kind of the scale of the project.
Just as a bit of a recap of there, I think there's some really key points that we've talked about. There are different types of flooding. So we've got river flooding, we've got flooding from the sea, we've got surface water flooding, flooding from reservoirs, and flooding from infrastructure such as canals or sewage pipes. I think One of the key things they talked about in Dan and Helena is using flood modelling to refine outlines and to ensure that you've got a really well fixed baseline. And that was one of the key constraints they mentioned, that clients often forget to get a baseline fixed and agreed with the regulator before you move forward. I think the top tips were, again, making sure you've done the right engagement and getting everything agreed up front. And then the other final point that we had from today was the difference in cost that we could see. The regulators, the lead local flood authority and the planning authority wanted a lot more detail in the assessments, and that's having a knock-on effect to the costs. Thank you very much for listening. Please look at us on enzygo.com, on our Instagram and LinkedIn channels, and hopefully you'll join us again for another podcast or video. Thank you.